Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. I don't know what your usual protocols are in terms of questions and so on and so forth, but I'm totally happy to take questions as we go, or if anybody wants to monitor the chat and ask me questions, feel free to just interrupt anytime. It seems like it's a small enough group that it would make sense. Um, so I'm going to be talking about some of the work that we've been doing in terms of using computational techniques to study and try to improve resource allocation. Specifically, I'm going to be talking in the context of homelessness. This is work with colleagues and grad students at mostly at Washington University in St. Louis, where I was before I just moved to George Mason this year. And so I'll mainly be talking about two papers, one with Amanda Kuby and Patrick Fowler, and another one with Quan Nguyen and Roman Garnett. So without further ado, let me kind of jump into it and get going. So I think, given that this is a fairness in AI seminar, there's probably most of you have, read or at least heard of these books. Cathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction was perhaps notable for being, one of the first to really kind of sound the alarm on what algorithms are doing in society and kind of what kinds of impact they may be having. And I'm sure, I think it's had a lot of impact on the public discourse. Virginia Eubanks' book, Automating Inequality, is a really interesting um, set of studies that really take kind of an ethnographic approach to understanding the roles of algorithms in people's lives. And these and many other things in the recent past have caught a lot of attention in terms of thinking about what are the kinds of bias that AI can introduce or algorithms in general, and what do we need to worry about and be concerned about in these kinds of settings. Um, at the same time, in the kind of work that I've been doing and that I know many of you do, we often think about actually sort of how can algorithmic techniques and thinking about sort of engineering different processes appropriately, how can they actually help improve outcomes? So many of these examples, my background is largely at the intersection of computer science and economics, and so many of my examples come from exactly that kind of space. But there's a famous example. So Al Roth won the Nobel Prize in economics partly because of his work on matching, which is related to what I'll talk about today. But one of the famous things that he did was help redesign the market for matching graduating MDs with their first residency positions, taking into account the preferences of couples instead of just doing an individual match. And that's kind of an example that's also been used down the line. People have used it a lot in sort of school choice in large public school districts, for example. It's being used increasingly in novel applications, like trying to figure out how to match refugees to particular towns, especially in Europe. Um, John, who of course couldn't be here today, but has worked a lot, and I've worked with him sometimes on the allocation of organs for organ transplantation and thinking about algorithmic techniques in that space. So these are all kind of positive ideas, and so what I really want to think about is I think a lot of the discourse around fairness in AI centers around a couple of different things. One is just like, can we audit and detect biases? And then the other side of it is often, oh, like how do we actually go about preventing these kinds of bad outcomes from happening? But I really want to kind of try to think about it from the perspective of how do we actually design systems that achieve the kinds of goals that we want to achieve, right? And so what I'm hoping to do is give a little bit of insight into our approach towards these problems in today's talk. So let me get going by sort of laying out the context for what we're going to try to do. So I'm going to be thinking specifically about resource allocation in a setting where these resources are ones that are either controlled or regulated by society. And for that reason, these are situations where we typically cannot rely on market mechanisms to achieve, the allocation of scarce resources that we often think of economics as studying, right? So examples of this are are widespread, right? They range from the social welfare net, right? So shelter beds and services for homeless households, which is what I'll focus on in today's talk, is just an example where, for the most part, we as a society have decided that, this is something that we need to be able to provide. Um, that this is not something that we can leave to market forces. That there's conversation about whether housing is a right, but we've increasingly been moving towards sort of housing first kinds of approaches. And this is something where we've just decided that, yeah, it makes sense, for these resources to be provided by, some form of governmental organization or structure. Similarly, we don't believe in most societies that markets should exist in organs for transplantation, and therefore we have to think about sort of other means for allocating organs. Spaces in public schools is another thing where we often think about sort of, what is the fair way to go about sort of distributing these spots, because even within, especially in large public school systems, right, there can be major differences between the kinds of education that students may be able to get in one part of the system versus another part of the system. So how do you go about thinking about what is the right way to make these allocations? So if we think about sort of the kind of ill-defined problem of how do we best allocate these resources to those who need them, and we try to quantify some of this in the language of algorithms that we all like to think about, then we realize several things that we have to do in this process, right? So we have to at least do, I think of these as sort of three big things, but obviously I may have missed things as well. One is we need to define what our objectives are, right? What is it that we're actually trying to achieve through this allocation of scarce resources? Our goals could involve efficiency, equity, different concerns about justice or fairness. The second thing that we have to do is we have to predict outcomes. That is, we have to think about, if we were to give this resource to this person or this household, how effective do we think that would be? Because that can be an important part of our consideration. And finally, we need to consider what are the preferences of the different agents who are participating in these mechanisms, and what are the possible incentives that the system that we create might lead to, which could end up sort of changing the behaviors of the agents that are participating in these systems. Right, so these are all, to me, sort of very, very interesting problems. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the first two largely, which is thinking about how do we define objectives, how do we predict outcomes, and what is the interplay between these two. We've also been working on this other problem of considering preferences and incentives within the context of these mechanisms, and I'd be happy to talk about that either during questions or offline if anyone's interested in that. So I'm going to be talking today about homelessness services, and so let me give you a little bit of background on the societal impact of this problem, right? So homelessness is a major sort of public health threat, and despite many, many efforts to contain it, ever since we've started getting, reasonably good national data, starting in 2007, when the Department of Housing and Urban Development began to track this better than it had in the past, there's been barely any decrease in the level of homelessness in the United States. Just to sort of give you an example, one can pull out a lot of different statistics, but one that always kind of strikes me is that you take one night in January 2018, it's winter, it's cold. They do these sort of census surveys kinds of things, and on that particular night, there were more than 110,000 American children living in homeless households. So that is just, the number of children. And this is in sort of one of the richest societies in the world. The majority of these were either in emergency shelters or temporary accommodations. It's actually a very, very costly problem along many different fronts. So it's estimated that we end up paying socially more than $4,000 per month per homeless individual. So that is, that's not just in the immediate costs of, running shelters and so on, but it's also across the different kinds of services that end up being necessary to serve this population and our interactions with this population, including things like the healthcare system, where there's obviously a lot of interactions with emergency rooms and so on, the criminal justice system, the civil justice system, homelessness services themselves, and so on and so forth. Now that's just sort of, measuring it in terms of costs, but if you actually think about it from the perspective of like, what's going on with these people, it's even worse because homelessness is basically considered what we call a base problem, right? It's very hard to deliver other services. So for example, mental health services or the kinds of services that we expect children to be able to receive, it's very hard to deliver these effectively to homeless populations, much more so than to populations that are stably housed. So the homeless system in the US, to give you a little bit of background on how it works, is largely funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's coordinated through a network of local agencies, and so it ends up being very decentralized in terms of how resources actually end up being provided, right? So there's more than 24,000 agencies that are providing homeless services across more than 416 communities in the US. And this is kind of a mishmash of there's what the federal government requires, which is certain universal elements in the delivery of these homelessness services, plus a lot of local discretion in deciding how to implement those mandates and how to deliver services to the population that sort of your community is responsible for. And that includes things like, how do they run emergency shelters? What are the different types of short-term and long-term housing supports that they provide? And how do they go about sort of tracking, who's eligible for what, when do they decide to move from one kind of service to another, and so on and so forth. There's been some work in sort of, what I think of as the conventional kind of analytics approach towards trying to solve these problems, right? So that includes typically what we'll think of as predictive risk assessment, which says, we're going to assign risk scores to agents, and these agents, when I say agents, I could in general be meaning, any different sort of unit in which resources can be provided. So these could be individuals, they could be households, they could be families. And then we're going to use that risk assessment score to either prioritize different service levels, that is sort of give more intense services perhaps to those who are higher on that risk scale, or to triage for services in the first place, that is, decide which ones will be investigated further, which cases will receive more attention, and so on and so forth. Today, I want to kind of take a different approach and sort of, essentially try to push the point that like, there's a lot more that we can do other than sort of, coming up with these scores for individuals. And so the first part of my talk is going to be on improving social welfare overall. And the key idea over there is, can we leverage heterogeneous treatment effects? That is the idea that different households may be better served by different types of services to actually come up with better outcomes for the population as a whole. And then, and that'll also sort of give some background into, what is the way in which we formalize this problem. And after that, I want to talk a little bit about conceptualizing and quantifying notions of fairness and justice in this space. And in particular, I'm going to think about trying to formalize a notion of justice or local justice that is often used both in political philosophy and in practice in terms of sort of identifying and triaging individuals, but that hasn't received much attention in the literature on sort of formalizing allocation processes thus far. So with that, sort of let me jump into kind of the first part of what we're going to try to do. And as I said, feel free to interrupt at any point in time. I know that I think Leo posted a note on the chat, so you're welcome to sort of either send him a note or, I've become used enough to teaching on Zoom that that I try to monitor the chat most of the time, and it's not a big enough crowd that would be a big problem. So feel free to post in there as well if you want. So so here's sort of a basic, very simple cartoon of the intuition for what we're going to try to do in the first part of this, right? The question over here is, when can we improve social welfare? When I think about social welfare in this kind of utilitarian formulation. And in this picture, let's say green is households and red is resources. So this is an example where we have a sort of homogeneous preferences or valuations or so on and so forth. That is, whoever gets matched to the top resource gets a value of 3, and whoever gets matched to the bottom resource gets a value of 8. right? So in this kind of a situation, there's not much I can do in terms of at least utilitarian social welfare, because one of if I have to do a one-to-one matching, because one of these agents is going to get the top resource, one of them is going to get the bottom resource. It's just a question of the distribution, right? Which one gets the top resource, which one gets the bottom resource. And I can see that, like, either way, I'm going to end up with an additive kind of social utility of 11 in this case. On the other hand, consider something at the other extreme, right? In this case, if I go with the parallel match, then both agents get a value of 3, whereas if I go with the diagonal match, both agents get a value of 8. So that's just an example of where heterogeneity in match quality can actually give us the potential to improve significantly better outcomes than we would be able to otherwise. Now, how does this relate to the homeless system? So I'm going to be talking about sort of, the homeless system and how it works as a moving target, but I'm going to be talking about a particular mechanism that was in use for quite a long time in St. Louis, which was basically that services were delivered through the following process, where those who were in need would call a hotline. If they were able to be allocated a resource, they would get allocated actually one of 5 different types of resources, but I'm going to simplify that down to 4 for reasons I'll explain in a second. So let's just think about these 4. So somebody calls, if they are sort of eligible for resources at that point in time and there is space, they will get allocated either to transitional housing, rapid rehousing, an emergency shelter, or homelessness prevention. You could think about these to some extent in terms of cost. Transitional housing is sort of very expensive to administer. It involves sort of both finding people space and finding them a network of supports and referrals and counseling and so on. Rapid rehousing is expensive, but not as much. It came online during the last financial crisis, and it was basically trying to find people, places to live very quickly. Emergency shelters are what we typically think of as, the primary kind of support for the homeless population. Homelessness prevention actually involves not necessarily finding them a bed space, but sort of giving them a combination of cash and other resources that can hopefully help them without having to provide sort of shelter space. And that's because, homelessness sometimes is not actually a function of literally not having a home to live in. It could be that your home is uninhabitable. And for example, that could just be because it's the middle of winter, you haven't paid your gas bills, your heating has been shut off, those kinds of things, right? So, so in that case, providing you resources to pay off your heating bills might be a sufficient resource. But we're basically going to think of this as an allocation problem where people are getting allocated one of these 4 resources. What we're going to use as kind of our measure of outcomes is, did the household will receive services for a particular period of time. And once they are done receiving services, they kind of exit the homelessness system. And then the question we ask is, did they re-enter within the next 2 years? And if they did, then that's considered a failure. If they didn't, then we consider that kind of a successful exit from homelessness. 2 notes that I'll make is that in our data set, we don't look at those who do not receive an intervention, which is potentially a more important question, actually, right? Who gets and who doesn't. But for the purposes of this study, we're really looking at kind of the more focused question that says, okay, can we look mainly at those who did receive interventions and think about sort of what would happen if we reallocated among the interventions that they received. And we're also not going to look at those who ended up being allocated to a particular resource called permanent supportive housing, just because that's actually kind of a different type of resource. And as the name suggests, it's intended to be more permanent, and it's intended for those with sort of greater needs. And so it's unclear whether this measure of re-entry that we're looking at is a reasonable measure for that population. It's also a relatively small number, and so we don't look at those. So if we just think about it within this framework, we can frame resource allocation in this world as an assignment problem, right? We have n agents, we have k interventions, each of them has some capacity uj. Each agent is to be assigned to exactly one of these interventions. And then let's say we have a cost that agent I incurs when assigned to intervention J. In our case, that cost is going to be just the probability of re-entry into the system. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, right? But let's assume that we have these costs. Here's a sort of simple example where suppose we have 4 agents and we have 3 different types of interventions. Intervention 1 has a capacity of 1, intervention 2 has a capacity of 2, and intervention 3 again has a capacity of 1. Then you can solve the assignment problem to come up with the sort of utilitarian welfare maximizing allocation, which would allocate agent 1 to intervention 1, agents 2 and 3 to intervention 2, and agent 3 to intervention 3. All right, so that's kind of the basic framework that we're looking at. So what do we do in this case? So what we are going to look at is we're basically going to take a look at this data kind of weekly, and we're going to kind of solve an IP version of the assignment problem that can be shown always has integral. So we'll relax to the LP. It can be shown that this always has integral solutions. And we're going to basically be trying to minimize the aggregate reentry, right? So I'm going to be trying to minimize the sum over agents and interventions of Pij, Xij, where Xij is the decision variable telling me whether or not household I is placed in intervention J. And our 2 sets of constraints are, first of all, we need all of the, so the first constraint up here is basically just saying each agent, that's a household or an individual, can only be assigned to 1 of the interventions. And then the second constraint over here is saying we must respect the capacities of the interventions. And so what we do with that is we basically do this on a weekly basis, right? We basically look at our data set and we look at who entered during a particular week. And we take the capacities of the interventions to be the number that that intervention actually admitted in that particular week. And we do this kind of reallocation to see, okay, if we had these Pij estimates, what is the best that we could have done, and how can we compare that to how we did do actually in practice? So the key question over here becomes sort of where do these Pij values come from? Because once you get them, it's a pretty simple kind of problem to solve. But how do you get them and how do you validate them? And that's sort of, combining that with this framework is really kind of the key idea over here. So we have data on 13,940 households from 2007 to 2014. Oh, I should have, this table is a little bit out of date. We actually have 35 features, not 68, because we discovered that some of these features are duplicates. So we end up with 35 features, of which 3 are binary, 4 are continuous, and the rest are categorical, right? So the binary features are gender, whether there's a spouse present, and whether this person meets the definition of chronic homeless. The continuous features are age and monthly income, which are in our data set, and 2 that we kind of create from the longitudinal data set, which is how many times have they called the hotline before and how long have they been waiting from the first time they called the hotline. And then we have various categorical features like veteran status, do they have a disabling condition, do they have a history of substance abuse, and so on and so forth. So in actual fact, about 29% of them re-entered within 2 years of leaving the intervention. And one interesting thing that I'll point out over here that is different from most of the work that has been done is that we actually have this data on calls to the hotline. And the cool thing about that is that that's actually a measure of need. Usually people think about reentry as actually re-entering the system, that is getting resources. Now that actually is a combination of 2 things, right? It's a combination of both measuring need and the availability of space. And so by using this hotline data, we're able to disentangle kind of those 2 and just look at need. So of these, you can see that, like, of those who are being assigned to these different interventions, the percent that ended up re-entering is very different across the different types of intervention. But one thing that you have to remember is obviously that this is highly sample selected, right? Those who are being allocated homelessness prevention are typically a very different population than those who are being allocated, let's say, emergency shelter. Because, homelessness prevention, you're kind of in a better state at the point in time at which you're considered eligible for that. So it's not as simple as saying that even though homelessness prevention is, the cheapest resource out there, we can't just put everybody into homelessness prevention because that's not suitable for some of the population. So the first question over here is, okay, what we want to do is we're going to eventually want to estimate these counterfactual probabilities to get Pij. But in order to do that, we want to actually look at various different machine learning techniques to try to figure out, okay, if I want to predict what is the probability that household I will re-enter given intervention J, let's look at measures of how well different techniques perform in terms of kind of the standard machine learning metrics, right? So we used 5 different methods. BART is the one that we're going to end up going with. It's Bayesian additive regression trees. And there's actually sort of a compelling theoretical reason why we wanted to go with that one in the first place, which is that it's actually been shown and used to estimate counterfactual probabilities well, which is a little bit different than most machine learning methods, which aren't really being thought of as performing causal inference, right? The idea for BART is that hopefully it will learn the response surface well enough that it'll be able to sort of make these counterfactual predictions well. But the other sort of reassuring part of it over here is that it actually does as well as any of, in fact, perhaps a little bit better than any of the other standard machine learning methods on just the standard kind of out of sample prediction tasks. So what we do is we train, we hold out a particular data set, and then we measure things like AUC, misclassification error, precision recall in terms of this re-entry metric. And we also look at calibration across the different interventions. And we find that, BART is arguably the best along sort of, all of these, all of the basic metrics, right? It gets the highest AUC, it has the smallest misclassification error, and it is the best calibrated along with gradient boosted trees. There's some interesting sort of specific differences over here that I won't get into, but that, I'd be happy to talk about offline if anyone's interested. But so this is kind of, gives us some double support for what we want to do. It's thought that BART is good at doing sort of counterfactual estimation, and at the same time, it is doing as well on the traditional machine learning metrics as the other problems. Now, why are we doing all this? And I just want to bring up a little point of comparison over here, right? The only other sort of work that is trying to do something similar to this, that is trying to leverage heterogeneous treatment effects, has been recent work on refugee allocation. That is, if you have certain data on refugees who are entering, let's say, the EU, and you're thinking about, or a particular country, like, can you think about what is the best place to locate them based on both their features and features of the place where you're locating them? And the metric that they use over there is a metric that they're using to try to measure kind of integration into society that includes things like, getting a job and so on and so forth. Now, the one thing that works nicely for them there is that historical data on refugee allocation is kind of quasi-random because of the way that they were allocated in the past. And so you can kind of leverage that to use traditional machine learning techniques to get good estimates of the probability that somebody will integrate, given that they're placed in a particular kind of location. In our problem, we don't really have that because, historical assignments have clearly been made based on sort of, human expertise and decision making. And so what we want to do is we want to actually make sure that we are careful about kind of the counterfactual inference problem that we're solving over here, and we hope that sort of BART is this evidence that we've got over here on both traditional metrics and prior work on BART for counterfactual inference provides enough of a grounding to say, yeah, this is a reasonable way of going about estimating those Pij values. So now if you take all of this into account and you actually estimate these Pij values using BART and then solve the allocation problem, what do we get? So what we did was we ran this on about 10,000 households starting in October 2009, going through December of 2012, which gave us 166 weeks. And every time what we did was we trained BART on all the historical data going up to that week, used it to predict the Pij values for that week, and then fed that into the allocation. We see sort of 2000 from this data set, we see about 2000, we see exactly 2,765 actual reentries. And if we were to just use BART to predict reentries given the actual intervention received, it would predict 2,725, which is very close, suggesting it's an unbiased estimator on this front, right, on the treatments that were actually received. If we do the optimal reallocation in the way that I described earlier, we see that we only get 2,155 reentries, right? So that is about, we're doing about 600 people better, which is actually a pretty significant improvement in terms of the number of households and families compared to what we had earlier. So this is basically suggesting that, there is potential over here to leverage some of this match heterogeneity to end up improving outcomes overall, even staying within the constraints of the original allocation in terms of just how many households get each of those particular allocations. And just to give you a sense of sort of what is the best that we could do, if we did not have any capacity constraints, and every household were directly placed in the best intervention that it could get, then our predicted reentry probability ends up being about 18%. So, we've gone a large way of that distance between 27.5 and 18% by using this particular technique. So we think that there is actually significant promise to doing things like this in this area. The other question that you have to ask in this kind of a situation is just which population are you helping? Is there a population that you're hurting, and so on? And so if you actually look at the reassignments, you find that 39.5% of households end up having a lower reentry probability under the new assignment, and 28.1% of them end up having a higher probability of reentry. So then we tried to understand, what are the characteristics of these households, which ones are helped and which ones are hurt. And actually it was kind of heartening in that sense of the ones that seem to be helped are actually the ones that seem to be in greater need. Those with lower monthly incomes, those who've been waiting for longer, and those who have made more calls to the hotline before being placed, as well as those where the head of the household has a disabling condition, tend to be the most helped by the reallocation that our mechanism is suggesting in this case. So that kind of wraps up, the first part of what I wanted to talk about over here, right? Which is basically, okay, what can we achieve within the constraints of this kind of a system by just kind of, thinking about considerations of, will agent A do better when allocated to resource alpha or allocated to resource beta, and can we do better by swapping, the assignments of A and B overall? So what I want to move on to for kind of the second part of the talk is actually thinking more explicitly, instead of efficiency and sort of how much of a win can we get with efficiency, let's directly think about considerations of justice. And so what I want to do over here is I want to tie some of this into some of the theoretical literature in political philosophy that helps us understand this. And well, maybe before I jump into this, I'll just quickly take a minute to see if anyone has questions on kind of the first part, because this is a reasonable time to just stop and see if there are any burning questions about, either the application or the framework or anything else. So Mary asks, yeah, sorry, I should have been clearer about that. Does that mean that the service they receive can change weekly? No, not at all. So what we're basically doing is we're deciding at the point of entry which service they get. So the weekly reallocation is just reallocating the individuals who happen to enter that week. So it's basically just batching them at a weekly level and saying, hey, this household was given emergency shelter, but maybe in the new allocation they'll be given transitional housing. But once you get an allocation, you're set. You stay in that particular thing until you exit the system. So do the people receiving services get to express preferences? So they do not actually, right? And the way that this typically works is that there's this intake interview where people are collecting all of this information on them, but the decision has typically been made by a caseworker, right? And so what we're trying to do in this case is we're trying to compare the decisions that caseworkers ended up making with kind of a hypothetical decision that an algorithmic method could make um, based on the same data that is available to the caseworker. Awesome, thank you. Great questions. So okay, so then let me so how do the caseworkers respond? So this is another really great question. It's actually, we haven't looked at that yet, but that is the next stage of what we're doing. So Amanda is about to start. We're just going through IRB approvals to start doing semi-structured interviews with a bunch of people who are stakeholders in the system to see whether we can, I mean, the eventual goal would be to perhaps employ, to perhaps be able to give them an additional kind of tool that they could use to either help recommend decisions or something like that. But we're kind of interested in starting off by getting their reactions on what this kind of system would do. At the moment, it's just it's still kind of proof of concept here. So, of course, the other problem over there is just that the actual system keeps shifting in response to both realities on the ground and political wind. So the really good news right now is just that there's going to be a lot more resources available than there have been over the past several years. And so, hopefully that'll just kind of overshadow everything else and just lead to a lot better, ability to serve this population in the coming years than we've had in the past few, which might, really mitigate the need to think about optimizing within the resources that we have. But yeah, we're very interested in sort of learning a little bit more about that. Um, okay, so now what I want to think about is sort of more generally, right, trying to tie some of this into the theoretical literature on how local institutions allocate scarce resources. And John Elster has this great book that my discussion is largely based off of, called Local Justice from 1992, that discusses a lot of sort of history of this and thinking about sort of where these institutions come from. And there's kind of a couple of basic insights over there. One of these is that, decision making on who receives scarce resources tends to be very setting specific. And also that this is kind of a local issue that individual and this very much comes up in the context of homelessness. It also comes up in organ allocation, where different regional groups make different decisions and so on. But each of these is kind of having a local view over the particular resource that they're allocating, and there's nothing in there to prevent kind of global injustices. And so we're not really talking about global problems like tax policy or how should wealth be distributed in society. We're talking about sort of very specific individual settings about specific resources and specific populations. Now, historically, there have been many, many different ways in which, and there still are ways in which allocation systems work, right? Some of these are based on status. They can be based on age and gender, like women and children first on the lifeboats, those kinds of things. Very popular is waiting time, right? Any kind of queuing system allocates resources based on how long you've been waiting, and the longer you've been waiting, the higher your priority becomes. Power and influence. So legacy admissions in Ivy League schools is an important one in the US. Having grown up in India, like just around the tail end of the time of the license Raj, that's another example of resources getting allocated according to influence. We have a bunch of lottery systems. Public schools often use lotteries to decide, who gets into language immersion programs or things like that. The kind that I'm kind of interested in studying over here, because it relates directly to some of the work we do as computer scientists, is principles that actually take into account specific properties of individuals and the interaction between the individual and the allocated resource. So in those, like, I'm going to try to formalize this in a relatively simple way, but suppose you can reduce individual welfare to a single dimension W. Even within this, there's many different kinds of allocation systems. So there are systems that prioritize based on, for example, minimum pre-allocation W. That is, serve the most vulnerable first, right? So this is actually realized in the context of several homeless systems that work on what's called the VI-SPDAT scores. Liver transplant recipients are prioritized based on the MELD scores, which is really a measure of sort of, how badly you're doing right now. And roughly, again, this is not exact, right? But this corresponds to some kind of Rawlsian notions of justice, right? Where you have some kind of max-min allocations. In this case, you're thinking about, okay, let me give the resources to those who are in the most need. There are alternative situations where you want to maximize the post-allocation welfare. That is, who is best served by this resource in the sense of who will do best after they get it, right? Um, so this idea again roughly coincides with efficiency. So you could say, okay, given limited medical resources, I want to minimize mortality, or I want to maximize exits from homelessness. It can be used thinking in the context of gifted and talented programs in school systems. That is, you want to find people who will do the best after they go through this, and so on. And then the third one, and the one that I really want to think about over here, that I'll try to go through somewhat quickly in the next 10 minutes or so, is what Elster calls the increment criterion. That is, allocate by prioritizing those who would have the most value added from receiving the intervention. Now, this seems similar to the others, but actually it's not. It's distinct from both of the other cases that we've looked at. And examples of this include things like battlefield triage, where typically the folks who get the attention of medical personnel who are on a battlefield are those who are in the middle, those who would have their probability of survival increased the most by actually receiving treatment from one of the medical professionals. Now that's basically saying I'm going for those in the middle. Those who are unlikely to survive are not going to get that kind of attention, and those who are likely to survive even without intervention are also not going to receive that kind of attention. So this thing, right? It leads to this problem of abandonment, which is that we're just sort of letting some people die in the case of battlefield triage. And it's something that is debated a lot, right? But this came up a lot in the last year, especially sort of about last April, when people were very, very worried about ICU and ventilator capacity. People were actually thinking explicitly about, what can we do in these cases? And I want to think about sort of, that particular idea of formalizing this increment criterion and seeing where it gets us. One important point to make is that these are considered in terms of the individual. So this W is really about some measure of the welfare of the individual, not in terms of their value to society, which is another thing that we used to think about a lot, like 20, 30 years ago. Some of you may have heard there's a great NPR podcast or something on the Seattle God Committee that at the time was determining access to dialysis, right? And they would go through these considerations like, should we prioritize the businessman who is a father of 3 and contributes to his church, or the former alcoholic who is unmarried and doesn't have any children, or things like that, right? So in this case, we've explicitly kind of turned away from considering value judgments about what individuals are contributing to society in terms of making these prioritization decisions. Now, the interesting thing is that, if you think about any allocative systems that actually occur in practice, right, they're the result of an inherently political process. There are reasons why we end up with the particular mechanisms that we see in different domains. And so I think it's important to investigate the implications of these ideas from the perspective that these are real allocation systems that exist in practice. I'm not coming over here and speculating, hey, here's a fairness criterion I'm proposing, it's better than the others based on axioms 1, 2, and 3, let's analyze it. Instead, I'm saying this is something that we observe in society. Let's formalize it and see what we can learn from actually like formalizing these kinds of principles. I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about that in about 5 minutes and leave some time for questions. So remember, we looked at this sort of simple case, 4 agents, 4 interventions. Here's a version of that where this is the particular utilitarian or efficient assignment in this case, right? Agent 3 to intervention 1, agents 1 and 2 to intervention 2, and agent 3 to intervention 4 to intervention 3. Sorry, agent 4 to intervention 3. these days there's a lot of focus on Leximin, which is essentially it's a formalization of the Rawlsian criterion or the max-min principle, um, but sort of done iteratively over the population so that you minimize the largest cost and then you minimize the largest cost among those remaining and so on and so forth. And if you were to implement that idea in this particular toy example that I gave you, you'll see that we end up with a very different sort of eventual allocation, right? You have 3 of these agents that are receiving 0.8 because we didn't want anybody to receive 0.9 because we're really trying to go for this max min kind of principle iteratively. So what we do in this sort of recent paper is we actually formalize this increment criterion of Elster, and we call it LoINC, which is Leximin over individually normalized costs. And the idea is very simple. It basically says, what I'm going to do is that instead of doing Leximin on the original cost matrix, I'm basically going to do Leximin on the regret matrix for each individual. That is, find the best that they could have done in any intervention, and then just say, okay, what is the value added of each of the other interventions over that one? So I'm going to lexicographically minimize the largest increase from the lowest cost that an individual could have had. And we can see that, like, what this would do, let me show you, is it would basically subtract off the minimum value in each of the rows, giving us something like this, and then we figure out, okay, what is the intervention here? And we can see that the assignment that we get in this particular case actually coincides with the efficient assignment rather than the Leximin assignment. And the main intuition behind that is just agent 4 is a high cost agent no matter what. And so there's not a huge amount of additional benefit that I'm getting by giving them sort of the better resource. So this is definitely formalizing a different ethical principle over here. But what we're interested in is sort of understanding the implications of that. And so we study it in terms of the price of fairness, which is this kind of classic measure that says, okay, what is the cost of this particular assignment that we get under this notion of justice or fairness? And how does that compare to the cost of the efficient assignment? And we know that, in many of these settings, there exist results that say, okay, with the 0-1 cost, the price of fairness of Leximin is less than or equal to n. And you can see kind of the standard kind of toy example of where you would end up with that kind of a situation is this, right? So you have this kind of a situation where the efficient assignment would be 0-0-1. However, if you implement Leximin, then you're going to end up with the 1 minus epsilon, 1 minus epsilon, 1 minus epsilon assignment. And so you end up with a cost of essentially that's O of n overall. So if we actually do LoINC on the exact same example, we actually see that LoINC will give us the efficient assignment in this particular case because I'm subtracting those off. And so I do much better than Leximin on this particular case. However, I can also easily construct pathological cases for Leximin just by changing the setup a little bit. So here's an example where I get something pathological for Leximin. It's a little bit better in terms of the bound that I can get. I get a bound of n-1 rather than a bound of n. Perhaps more interestingly, right, what we can think about is we can actually think about, can we prove better bounds in some specific cases, and what does that tell us? And so if we add one other assumption onto what we've been talking about, in this case, we assume that our cost matrices have sorted rows. That is to say, interventions can be generically ordered in terms of how helpful they are, and they end up being helpful to this in the same order to everyone, right? So this isn't in general going to be true. For example, it's not true in our homelessness data, but it might be approximately true, and there's situations where it might be very close to true. So for example, if you're thinking about care of COVID patients, right, it's probably true that probability of survival increases as you go from home care to hospital bed to ICU bed with a ventilator, for example. So if you take these two, I won't get into the details, but we can actually show that you can get significantly better bounds under this assumption of sorted rows where the actual bounds are going to end up depending on distributional assumptions that you make on where your cost values are coming from. But the cool thing is that when the number of different types of interventions that you have is significantly less than the number of agents overall, as is, for example, usually the case in homelessness, we typically have 4 or 5 different interventions we're considering, we end up with sublinear bounds. So if we actually do this on our homelessness data set, but instead of doing sort of the weekly reallocation we just considered as one big batch problem, this gives you some nice intuition. We can see that actually the total cost and the price of fairness doesn't even go up that much for Leximin. It's up to 1.025, which means it's only about 2.5% worse in terms of efficiency. But we can see that with LoINC, it's even smaller, right? The cost has just gone up by 0.3% compared to the cost of the efficient allocation. So it's basically telling us that in practice, and we did this with various probability distributions as well. So here's sort of 3 examples. This is the uniform 0-1 distribution over costs. This is a bimodal distribution, beta 0.5.5. And this is a kernel density estimate based on our homeless data set. And we use these to stochastically generate cost matrices. And what these 2 graphs show is the one on top is the actual empirical price of fairness. And what we can see is that even for Leximin, the empirical price of fairness tends to not be that high overall, right? It's in the range of 5% or so. But LoINC, which is the orange line over here, is actually basically very, very close to the efficient assignment almost always. The bottom graphs show the dependence of the actual bound, which is a theoretical bound, which is of course weaker than what we observe in practice with these probability distributions. So this is kind of interesting. I'll just sort of make one more empirical point over here, which is that the highest price of fairness typically comes when our cost distribution is highly bimodal. So that the beta 0.5, 0.5 is sort of one example. But the more bimodal you get, basically, if you go down to a beta 0.1, 0.1, that's when you're going to get the highest prices of fairness in these kinds of situations. And the intuition behind that is kind of similar to what these pathological examples we had constructed, right? Which is basically that you're either very close to having a utility of 1 or a cost of 1, or very close to having a cost of 0. And those are the situations where the price of fairness can actually get driven up very, very high. But just to kind of wrap things up over here, what are the main takeaways? So there's the main thing that we're trying to do with some of this work is, I think, well captured by a quote from a recent paper of Rediet Abebe and co-authors, which is called Roles for Computing in Social Good. And it says, as a formalizer, computing shapes how social problems are explicitly defined, changing how those problems and possible responses to them are understood. And that's kind of the way in which I see a lot of the work that we're doing over here. We're really hoping that by formalizing some of these ideas and by studying the implications of different decision-making mechanisms, we'll be able to inform policy, both at sort of, the level of individual agencies and caseworkers, but also sort of at a level where you're thinking about, what are the tools that we can deploy at a large scale. The 2 sort of most interesting research results, I think, that I'm trying to get across here are, first, that it may be possible in real world settings to leverage match heterogeneity to improve overall outcomes and to really sort of potentially lower societal costs. And secondly, by formalizing this increment criterion of Elster as LoINC, we see that in practice and across many simulated distributions, it seems to be somewhat better aligned with the efficient allocation than Leximin, which is the Rawlsian notion of going max-min. And I think that that's very interesting, and it kind of sets up potentially some future research to think about, is this part of the explanation for why this has been a criterion that, otherwise it's kind of a non-obvious criterion, actually, if you think about it. But it may be a way to understand why it has actually been popular in certain societal settings, because because we end up kind of, getting closer to the efficient allocation, but we're still respecting some notion of justice over there by thinking about those who would be helped the most. And so I think there's many interesting things to explore over there. Finally, let me just conclude by saying, none of this would be possible without my amazing co-authors. So Amanda is a senior PhD student at WashU. Patrick is a public health and social work professor at WashU who works very closely with homeless services and with those who are looking into the area of child maltreatment and neglect, and trying to think about sort of improvements in those areas. Roman is also faculty at WashU, and Kwan is a PhD student working with Roman, who's now switched mostly to working on other things, but they were instrumental to much of this work. Thanks for funding from NSF, an NSF Amazon FAI grant, and the WashU Institute for Public Health. And finally, thank you all for your attention and questions. And I hope you thought it was interesting, and I'd love to chat more either now or offline with anyone who's interested in this work.
Thank you, Sanmay. That was very interesting. People can unmute themselves and ask directly questions now if you have any. No need to type them.
Hey, Sanmay, this is Aravind.
Hi, Aravind.
Hi. Yeah, I have a comment more than a question. It was an excellent talk, and as you can hear in the background, I have to jump onto a different call now, but I do want to have a longer discussion with you about some of the technical points, so I will connect with you offline. So one request, this may be helpful for other people here as well. If you're willing to share your slides, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I can send them to Leo and.
Okay, wonderful.
Yep.
Thanks again.
Sure thing.
Bye.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, there is another question in the chat.
Wow. Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I think that yeah, I mean, I feel like we're really intrigued. That's totally fine. We're really intrigued to see what happens in next steps. So we are very much looking forward to hearing what the responses are going to be from those who are on the ground, like caseworkers and so on and so forth, and thinking about both, the level of how can one maybe make some of this directly useful to them in terms of like, either a decision support tool or just something that you can kind of do integrative human AI decision making or something like that, but also to thinking about sort of implications for policy. So thanks for that comment.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, thank you so much again.
I have a quick question, if I may interrupt you.
Yeah.
I was wondering, could you give some advice on how to identify the right justice principles or principles for allocation of resources? Because that is what I find most often difficult, deciding like, should I study legislation, talk to stakeholders, and how to come up with how to distribute resources.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a super interesting question. So I mean, I guess my first suggestion would be, if you haven't read Local Justice, order it on Amazon and take a look. I mean, it's a little bit sort of not out of date. I would say it's it doesn't include sort of more recent developments in the last 20 years or so, but at the same time, so much of things that we think are new have actually been thought about before, that I think it's just a fascinating insight into that, right? So I think that's kind of a first step over there. And I think that the other thing that one learns from that is that it's inherently both a local process and a political process to end up sort of making a decision on who gets what, right? And I think some of the case studies that are interesting in recent years are all of the stuff that's been happening in the school choice domain, especially in Boston, and like the school allocation mechanisms there, and so on and so forth. And you can just see how different stakeholders end up influencing the eventual kinds of decisions that end up being made. So I guess my advice is just that I think that for any particular domain, the thing to do is to talk to the local agency that is currently tasked with distributing that resource to try and understand, why is it done the way in which it's done, and what are the different sort of constraints that are coming in. Because in homelessness, right, it's a function of, hey, we won't get money from the federal government unless we do these things. So these things we are required to do, and then we're going to be evaluated based on these metrics, and so we're going to try to optimize these metrics. But at the same time, we're also trying to do the best that we can for our population. And by the way, if we're in St. Louis, then there's this particularly weird thing about the division between the city and the county, and that itself leads to different decisions about what different shelters are doing, because can city shelters accept people from the county? Can county shelters accept people from the city? And so on and so forth. And it just ends up being, so any individual data set that you look at ends up being very idiosyncratic to what are the constraints of the decision makers there. So if there's a particular application that you're interested in, right, I would say that the first thing to do is really talk to the people who are currently in charge of doing that and of distributing those resources, and kind of tread carefully there, because they may not want to have that kind of snatched away from them either. But I think it's super useful to understand the constraints that they're working within.
Great, thank you.
Any more questions? I suppose not. Thank you so much again. And
yeah, thank you very much for having me. And I'll send you my slides if you
yeah.
do
That'd be great
with them.
That'd
Okay,
be great.
awesome.
Thank
Thanks
you.
everyone.
Goodbye,
Bye.
everyone.